My name is Michael. I am originally from Dallas. I was born and raised there, but my mother's family is from the state of New Mexico. I have worked as a language teacher all my life, which I really enjoy. The story I am going to tell you happened a few years ago due to personal reasons. My mother and I went to live with my grandmother in New Mexico. At first it was only going to be a few days, then a few weeks. And in the end we ended up staying for much longer. I was considering the idea of returning to Dallas, but I did not want to leave my mother alone. Shortly after, a family friend offered me a job at a university. It was in a neighboring town about an hour's drive away. Even though I had no plans to stay, I thought it would be a good idea to see what they were offering me. After talking to my mother, I showed up on Monday morning. I had a chat with the director of the program. We talked about possible schedules and also the salary they were going to offer me. Frankly, it wasn't a bad proposition at all. I had to work only 4 days a week, 3 of them teaching students of a degree, and on Saturdays, I would be working at the school's language center, where I would teach people of all ages. Seeing it as something temporary, it could work. I had all the government benefits. Plus, I continued doing what I liked, and I wouldn't have to leave my mother. That day, I returned home very thoughtful. I didn't know what to do. What started out of curiosity could really be a decision. That afternoon, I spoke with my mother. She was very excited about the proposal. I hesitated a lot about accepting, but I told myself that it would only be temporary, just a few months while I returned to Dallas. It was the next morning that I confirmed with the director that I was interested. She told me that I had to go as soon as possible for an interview, but that I shouldn't worry, that it was certain that I had the position. They just had to follow a protocol. By that same Wednesday, I was already presenting myself for my new job. After leaving teaching for 2 months, it was good to be surrounded by students again. It filled me with life and I loved teaching them. I started to get to know the groups, which was normal. In college they were teenagers and I already had experience in that. It wasn't difficult to keep up with them. Every morning I took the bus from my town to school. It dropped me off right in front of the entrance. During the afternoons when I returned home, I prepared the classes for the next day. I was very excited. I hadn't realized how much doing all that filled me with life. Saturday came at 8:30 in the morning. I was already in my classroom, which started at 9. I was going to have a group of 6 students. Then I heard someone knock on the door. I looked up. It was a light brown-skinned girl with deep black eyes. "Good morning. You are our new teacher," the girl says to me with a beautiful smile on her face. I introduce myself and she does the same. Her name is Valerie. I'm not going to lie, Valeria is a very pretty woman. She had wavy hair that reached a little below her shoulders, a very pretty smile, but what was most impressive was her confidence. She walked, she expressed herself with a lot of attitude. It was something that simply made you look at her. Besides, she knew she was pretty. All the other students began to arrive. The class started and everything was quiet. But one thing I could notice was that Valeria kept looking at me. We had a small 30-minute break. The students suggested that we all eat together. So we sat at the same table in the cafeteria. They were all very nice to me. Most of them were between 25 and 30 years old. We chatted a little, and when we stood up to go back to the classroom, Valeria gave me a gift. It was a small wrapped chocolate. I gave her my attention and thought about saving it for later, but she insisted that I eat it, that it was a gift with a lot of love. I didn't want to seem rude, so I did. The rest of the day went by normally. We finished class around 2 p.m. When I said goodbye to all the students, for some reason I couldn't stop thinking about how pretty that girl was. Maybe it might sound a little silly, but I felt like she was flirting with me several times during the day. The week went by normally. My students and my boss were happy with my work. I was also happy to have time to spend with my mother. It seemed like everything was getting better. When I got home, I was in a very good mood, being able to be with her. We were going through a complicated situation with my grandmother, and she needed my support every day. I won't deny that with the income I was going to have. How cheap it was to live in the village and keeping myself busy with my job made everything fall into place. I felt perfectly fine. Saturday came again. I arrived at the same time, at 8:30 in the morning. When I entered the classroom, Valeria was already inside. She gave me a big smile and kissed me hello. She asked me how my week was and that I had been practicing a lot on some topics, but that it was difficult for her. I told her that she had very good pronunciation and spoke very well, but she kept saying that she felt like she didn't know anything. I was giving her some tips so that she could see better progress. I'll be honest, there was something about her eyes that made me dizzy. It was like I couldn't concentrate when I was in front of her. It made me nervous. It had happened to me very few times, and when it did, I tried to just ignore it. Before the other students arrived, she pulled a cup out of a bag. It was coffee. She told me that it was just a little tension she had with me because she had liked my first class so much. I told her, thank you very much, that I loved coffee. The class started again. Everything was fine, although she still made me nervous. I didn't want to be confusing things, but the way she looked at me was different. In the dead times we had in class, my students would ask me some things about my personal life. I didn't go into details. I just told them that I didn't live there, that I came from a small town nearby. The class suggested that it would be a good idea to go out one Saturday after class. There was a small square in the town, and they were very excited to be able to give me a tour of the place. I thought it was a very nice gesture, and we agreed to do it sometime in the future when we were all free. The days went by, and every time I came to teach on Saturdays, Valeria always had something for me. Sometimes she would also give me candy after lunch, which I always thought was nice. In fact, some of the other students did it too, and even though my mother always told me not to accept food from other people, I didn't see anything wrong with it. I don't know how it all started with my students, but I remember that for some reason, Valeria kept coming to my mind more and more. It started little by little. When I was checking work, I thought about her. On Fridays, I was already a little anxious because it was that Saturday, and I was very excited to see her. In the mornings, she always had a coffee ready for me. One Saturday after class, she asked me if I could help her with a subject she didn't quite understand. The way she looked at me, I couldn't say no. I told her no problem. It was the least I could do. After all the attention she had given me, we were in the classroom for about an hour. I couldn't explain how comfortable I felt being there with her. It was like hearing her voice made me dizzy. We were almost finishing the private class. I had my notebook on my desk. When I was giving her some final tips to expand her vocabulary, she started making some little drawings in my notebook, smiling. I asked her what she was doing, since I couldn't guess what she had drawn. It was like a symbol. To tell the truth, it didn't even have a shape. She told me nothing. She just did it for fun. That afternoon she said goodbye with a kiss and a big hug. I felt her arms press me and I liked it a lot. The day ended. I left the classroom and waited for the bus that took me home. It was a little late. Daylight was running out. The bus was taking an hour to get on as there were people getting on and off in small towns. That was the reason I sat at the back, so as not to be bothered by people getting on and off. I was in one of the last seats. Fortunately, there was no one else around. I was falling asleep when suddenly I felt someone's eyes on me. I looked up and that's when I noticed it. 2 places in front of me, there was someone who was peeking slightly over the side of the seats. It seemed to be an elderly woman. I could only see half of her face. I felt a little uncomfortable. I don't know why, but she was looking at me in a strange way. Her eyelids were wide open. She didn't take her attention off me, and the strangest thing was that I didn't remember seeing her when I got on. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back, trying not to pay attention to her. The road we were passing through had many curves, so the bus was moving from one side to the other. At that moment, the driver suddenly slammed on the brakes, which made me jump and open my eyes suddenly. When I did and looked to the side, the old lady was sitting in the same row of seats as me, to my right. I started to get nervous. The woman was dressed like an old robe. Her hair was a little messy, but what caught my attention the most was the way she was wearing makeup. The shadow made her eyes look much deeper, and the poorly applied lipstick on her mouth made her look strange. I felt uncomfortable. Her face was completely turned in my direction. She kept looking at me very intently. I thought that maybe she was some person who was mentally ill. So what I did was move my seat. I didn't want to seem obvious, but the way she looked at me made me very uncomfortable. There was hardly anyone on the bus. I sat a few seats ahead. I looked out the window. It wasn't long before I got home when the driver stopped at the bus stop in my town. I stood up, looked back at the back seats just to see if the woman was still there, but to my surprise, there was no one. The back seats were empty. I don't know why, but I felt chills. There was no way the woman could have gotten off the bus. The only door to get off was in the front, and the bus didn't have any bathrooms. I told myself that maybe she got off earlier, and I didn't notice, so I tried not to pay much attention to it. Going back home, I had dinner with my mother and grandmother. Then I checked off my pending items that night and fell asleep in my bed. I just put my head on the pillow and fell completely asleep. When I woke up the next day, there was a different smell in my room. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but for some reason it seemed familiar. The week went by and the smell wouldn't leave my room. I asked my mother if she had put something there, but she said no. In fact, she came in and told me she didn't smell anything different. I told her it was no problem and didn't bring it up again. The days passed without me noticing. 2 months had passed since I started the work. After putting it off for several weekends, my students and I agreed to go for a walk in the town square. There was some kind of celebration going on, so it was going to be fun. After class, we went in one of their cars. In less than 15 minutes, we were arriving at Costco. The dance and poetry program would start around 5 p.m. They began to show me some interesting places near the square. We talked about everything a little. From time to time, my gaze met Valeria's. She always smiled at me. I felt like a teenager, as if the only thing my eyes were looking for was her face. When the civic program started, Valeria and I went to get some ice cream. "I'm so glad you're with us, teacher," she said as she placed her hand on my arm. We took the ice creams to the others. Valeria had mine. I remember that when she gave it to me, I felt like a prick in my finger. I looked at myself. My thumb had a slight red spot. Valeria came up to me and took me in her hands, took my finger and cleaned it with a napkin. The feel of her hands on mine made a shiver run down my spine. The afternoon passed. It was very pleasant. All my students behaved very well, but the only one I had eyes for was her. When I got on the bus to go to my town, I fell completely asleep, but a few minutes before arriving home, I began to feel dizzy. When my grandmother saw me, she told me that I was very pale. I told her not to worry, that maybe it was something I had eaten. With some tea, I would feel better. The next day I got up very late. It was around 12 noon. When my mother woke me up, I felt much better than yesterday. I stared at the ceiling for a few minutes, stretching. I put my hand under my pillow. When I pulled it out, I could see that there were thin hairs curling around my fingers. They were black, long like a woman's. I was very confused. I wondered how that got there. I removed my pillow. There were a few more. I thought they could be my mother's or my grandmother's. I stood up, still feeling tired. That afternoon, my grandmother made me a remedy for stomach pain and tiredness. On Wednesday, when I went to work, I felt strange. It was as if I didn't have all 5 senses. I was easily distracted, and my head hurt. When I woke up on Thursday, I couldn't go to work. I had a fever, and I felt very tired. Although that same afternoon I began to feel a little better thanks to the medicine the doctor had given me. I went out to the kitchen to eat with my mother and grandmother. Soon my grandmother began to complain about an owl in her yard. My mom told her it was just an animal and not to pay attention to it, but she quickly contradicted her, saying that those animals are bad luck. She didn't like it at all when I was in her yard. I didn't say anything. My grandmother had her thoughts stuck in her head, and there was no one to get her out of there. On Friday, I was feeling better. so I was able to go to work. I was in class checking one of my students' work. One of them jokingly asks me if I had a good time with my girlfriend. I, not understanding what she was saying, ask her why. Teacher, do you have bruises on your neck? Smiling and thinking it's a joke. I tell them no, that maybe some animal bit me during the night, but right after class ends. I go to the bathroom to look at myself in the mirror. It was true, I had bruises on my neck and I don't know where they came from. When I get home, I ask my mother what the origin of the marks on my neck could be. She sees them and tells me that it looks like someone sucked me. I showed it to my grandmother. She tells me the same thing. They start to question me if I'm dating someone. I laugh and tell them no, that I don't have to hide and that I shouldn't be complaining suspiciously. I ask her what it is. She simply replies that it's something to make me feel better. I think it's one of her ideas, so I do it to keep her calm and happy. On certain afternoons, I used to go out for a run around the town. When I first arrived, I would do it on the municipal court. But I remember that by then the fair had been set up there. So I couldn't remember that when I was little, my mother used to go for walks in the direction of the mango orchards. So that afternoon, I asked her what route I was taking. She recommended that if I was going to do it, I shouldn't go too far from the town. You never know what kind of people might be around. I left my house around 6 in the evening, taking advantage of the fact that there was still daylight but not much sun. I put on my headphones and started running in the direction of the mango orchards. Little by little, the houses fell behind, until I found myself surrounded by trees. The road was completely dirt. In fact, there weren't many people on it. About 30 minutes had passed and I had only found a cattle truck. Daylight was running out. The road stretched out in front of me. I looked at my cell phone and told myself it was time to go back. I stood for a moment on the side of the road, took off my headphones. There was absolute silence. The only thing I could hear was the wind moving the branches of the mango trees. I started my way back. At first I walked, but when I realized that night was falling very quickly, I started jogging. I was passing a small bridge that crossed a stream. When I was almost halfway there, I noticed a woman in the water. She seemed to be bathing. She had her back to me and was wearing a dark-colored robe. I looked away so as not to be indiscreet and continued on my way. I was getting dark in a certain way. I started to feel a little uncomfortable. I attributed it to the place. Yes, it was a little scary to be surrounded by so many trees in the dark. It was at one point when I looked back that I realized there was someone walking a few meters away. I couldn't see well because of the little light there was. But in a way I felt calmer. At least I wasn't alone. I continued jogging. Not more than a minute passed when I decided to look back once more. This time, the person who was behind me was no longer there. I thought it was because I was moving much faster than her. I was reaching a curve when in the distance I perceived a lump on the bank. It seemed to be the silhouette of a person. When I was a little closer, I realized it was a woman. What caught my attention was how she was dressed. She was wearing a robe. I realized that it looked a lot like the one the woman from the stream was wearing. But that wasn't possible. I had left her behind a long time ago. I had never seen her pass me on the road. I felt my body go on the defensive. The hairs on my neck began to stand up. Still, I continued forward. When I passed aside, I could see her face. That's when I froze. It was the woman who was with me on the bus a few weeks ago. My heart raced. She was staring into nothing. When I passed her side, she had the same expressionless look, her eyes wide open. I felt my legs weaken. There was something that didn't feel right. The first thing I did was start jogging much faster. Then I started running. There was something in the air that felt very wrong. Suddenly, the heaviness in my shoulders began to be unbearable. I didn't look back for the rest of the journey. I felt like my heart was almost jumping out of my chest. I don't know how to explain it, but I was terrified. Seeing the woman on the bus again scared me a lot. Something inside me told me that it was the woman who was in the creek. I also don't know why, but she seemed to be wearing the same robe. The walk back seemed endless. For some reason, I felt that if I turned around, I would see that woman behind me. I told myself that maybe I was exaggerating. I told myself that it was possible that she was an old woman who was not right in her mind, but as many times as I repeated it, I didn't believe it. When I started to see houses around me, I began to breathe calmly. When I arrived, my mother asked me if I was okay. My face was very pale. I, nervous, answered yes, that I was just a little tired. That night I had a hard time sleeping. I had that woman's face engraved in my memory, her silhouette on the side of the road, her face roasting on the bus seat. Just remembering it gave me chills. The days passed, and onto a Saturday morning, Valeria was already waiting for me in the classroom. She gave me my cup of coffee and hugged me. She asked me how I had been. I confessed that I was a little sick, but I was better now. When we were talking, she tried to touch my arm, which I don't know why, but it started to make me uncomfortable because of the expression on her face. I noticed that she noticed. My other students started to arrive. The day was going on quietly, but Valeria kept looking at me. During lunch, and as usual, I sat down to eat with them. She was next to me. Before finishing, she asked me if I changed my perfume. I answered no, that it was the same as always. She told me that I smelled strange, different. From her expression, it seemed that she didn't like it. When class ended, everyone said goodbye. This time she didn't stay, which seemed strange to me since she always had questions to ask after class. However, this time she didn't even say goodbye like she usually did. She just left the room. On Sunday, my grandmother gave me that stuff to drink again. It tasted horrible, but I won't deny that I started to feel better. Besides, who was I to question her techniques? During the early morning, a sound woke me up. It sounded like the noise of an animal, maybe a bird. I lived on the second floor of the house. In front of my bed was the window that looked out onto my grandmother's patio. I thought the animal would stop making the noise, but it kept on making noise, so I stood up. I went to the window, but I didn't see it. However, the sound seemed to be coming from my grandmother's mango tree. I tried to scare the animal away, but despite several attempts, it was still there, upset. I went back to my bed. I didn't know how, but fortunately I managed to fall asleep. During the following days, my grandmother was very convinced that the owl was a witch. She said that it was not at all normal for it to come almost every day to sit on the mango tree. Whenever I could, I went out to the patio to chase it away to avoid it from being in the house, and, to tell the truth, the last few days, during the nights, I always heard that bird sitting outside my window. I never saw him, but with all the things my grandmother was saying, I was starting to get nervous. Also, the memory of the woman from the stream wouldn't leave my head. On Friday night, I woke up in a panic, feeling like I was short of breath and had a horrible pressure in my chest. I tried to stand up, but I couldn't. My body felt too heavy. I tried to talk to someone, but my voice just wouldn't come out. I was desperate. I couldn't breathe properly. I tried 1,000 ways to stand up, but nothing worked. Also, I could still hear the owl outside the window. All I could do was move my hands very lightly on the mattress. I gave up. The next morning I felt strange. Before going to work, I told my mother what had happened. She told me that maybe it was just sleep paralysis. When I was on the bus to work, I felt very anxious. I really wanted to see Valeria again. It was like a roller coaster of emotions. When I got to the living room, she was already there. I'm not going to lie to you, she looked beautiful. She had a different glow. She greeted me and we were talking, and she was very close to me. I told her that I didn't sleep well last night, that I was a little tired. She looked at me, put her finger in her mouth, and then ran it behind my ear. She massaged there for several seconds, moving it in circles. Laughing, I asked her what she was doing. She told me that she was just trying to make me feel better. I looked at her a little confused, but I didn't say anything. Just looking into her eyes stunned me. She had a flirtatious expression that I liked. That night, during dinner, my grandmother looked at me in a strange way. When we finished, she told me to take another one of her remedies. It was to make me feel better. I told her that I already felt better, that it wasn't necessary. But my mother also began to insist. I simply wanted to keep them calm. Not even an hour had passed when I started to vomit. I was in the bathroom for a long time. I was very nauseous. I was angry. I thought that all of this was my grandmother's fault, so I swore I would never take anything else she gave me. However, I remember that I slept very well that night. I didn't even hear if the owl came to visit me. I went out with my mother and grandmother to buy some things at the market. I noticed that my grandmother was buying some palm leaf crosses. I asked her what they were for. She told me that they were to put in the house, since at night she kept hearing that bird. When we returned, she placed them on each of the doors in the house. She even put one on my bedroom window. That same evening, I asked her what she had given me to drink the other day, since I had fallen very heavy. With a serious face, she asked me how I had slept. I replied that I slept very well. My grandmother told me that our son thinks that someone is doing witchcraft on you. She told me while holding my hands. At first I thought she was playing with me, but soon I realized that she was serious. But why did she say that? She asked me if by chance someone had given me something to eat. I told her that my students did it all the time. She continued asking if there wasn't someone in particular, and I didn't feel strange or anxious to see someone in particular. The first person that came to my mind was Valeria. That's exactly how I felt with her. But I answered no. For some reason I was afraid to mention it. My grandmother already knew I was lying. She realized that something wasn't right. A few days ago it was mostly because of how I was behaving, but what alerted her were the hairs in my bed and the bruises on my neck. I looked at her surprised. I had completely forgotten about the hairs in my bed. I had kept finding them, but I assumed they were my mom's or my grandmother's. "How do you feel?" I answered that I felt fine, but what she gave me to drink made me feel very bad. Satisfied, she told me that it was normal that I had to take out everything they were giving me. I continued looking at her without understanding. She explained to me that she knew a man in the town who was in charge of doing cleansings. One day they met at the center. She was worried about the owl that was sitting on the mango tree. She asked him about it, and they started talking. She was in contact with him and told him some details of what was happening. The owl, how I started to get sick, the woman's hair, and the strange smells. She had suspicions. But now, with what I was taking, she had already confirmed it. "Look, my son, with the simple fact that what I am giving you has these effects on you, it is more than enough to confirm that something is not right." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Tell me something, son. Do you think about her a lot? Do you feel like you really want to see her? That you can't deny her anything?" I stay silent. And for my grandmother, that is a yes. "We should go to the healer," I tell you, because I am very worried. I really didn't know what to think. All this information came to me suddenly. It was a strange feeling. A part of me didn't want to believe what my grandmother was telling me. I had always thought that it didn't exist. But how could I know all these things? I was describing everything that Valeria made me feel. Besides the fact that everything else wasn't normal either, the memory of the woman on the bus came to my head. I told her that nothing was wrong, that I didn't believe in witchcraft or those things. I insisted that she not worry, but I'm sure she noticed the doubt in my voice. That night I had a hard time sleeping. I couldn't get what my grandmother was telling me out of my head. In the early morning I woke up once again. I was short of breath. When I opened my eyes I didn't realize it, but when I looked at the window, I noticed what seemed to be someone's head peeking around a corner. Quickly, that thing left my sight. But how was that possible? My room was on the second floor. I don't know why, but something told me that I knew who it was that was looming. I felt a horrible heaviness in my stomach. The idea that it had followed me home terrified me. I ran out of my room to my mother's room. She was scared, just like me. We went out to check the yard, but there was nothing. All the doors were closed. The next day, still with doubts, I decided to accompany my grandmother. The man who received us was a large, thin man with a calm demeanor. I remember very well that his house was small, but the atmosphere felt very light. He told me that what they were doing to me was stealing my energy, that he has a strong but very gentle character which made their job easier. I told him how I had felt, the strange smells in my room, the symptoms, and the way I dealt with Valeria. I even mentioned the woman who was following me. According to this man, I was undergoing a blood test that was very delicate. Thinking back, I remembered that afternoon in the town square when I saw the stain on my finger. The problem here is that you are giving them access. She is taking control because you are reciprocating it, he told me. That he was surely poisoning me through food, from the coffees in the morning, the sweets. He asked me if by chance I had kissed her. I answered no, because contact with the woman's saliva could also harm me. The memory came to my head when he put saliva behind my ear. I will be honest with you, I was very afraid of what this man was telling me. Everything fit. Perfection. On the table, he placed a red piece of cloth, put the image of a saint, as well as other things he had with him. Then he sewed it in the form of a painting. He told me that I had to always carry it with me, and more so when I was out of the house. He made another one, which I had to put under my pillow. He gave me a jar with a liquid. It looked like honey, but it was a little darker. I had to rub this one behind my ears before going to sleep. She told me to continue taking my grandmother's remedies and not to move the crosses on the windows under any circumstances. On Saturday, when I had to go to work, I felt very nervous. The last few days I had been feeling better. I no longer thought so much about Valeria and the way I did now. And somehow her memory made me uncomfortable. I carried the amulet that the healer gave me in my pants pocket. After arriving at the classroom, I began to prepare things for class. A few minutes later she arrived, already carrying 2 coffees in her hand. She smiled at me but did not greet me with a kiss or a hug. She gave me the drink. I tried not to look nervous. Despite how good she looked, I began to feel a certain rejection towards her. It was as if her presence put me on the defensive during the day. I tried not to make eye contact from time to time. Our gazes would meet, but I didn't play along. It all seemed strange to me. How was it possible to feel that way with her? One day after the class, she tried to approach me saying that she had bought me a chocolate. I accepted it but didn't eat it. I hurried away, saying that I had a meeting. Valeria looked at me annoyed. She knew what was happening. When I returned home with my grandmother, I told her everything that had happened. She told me that it was completely normal. What the healer had given me made me feel the true energies and intentions. That was the only way I could weaken what they were doing to me with the rejection. As the healer explained to me, what allows these types of people to go so far is the idolatry and praise that other people can give them. All we had to do was the opposite. Show that she had no power over me and that her physical qualities did not impress me. I could not stand those kinds of actions. Indifference and antipathy. I remember very well that one of those early mornings I got up because I heard someone knocking on my window. It was like little stones crashing against the glass. I looked out to see what was happening, but I did not open the window. She simply slid the owl looking into my room. That time was the first time I saw her. Her feather was white. The second Saturday I saw Valeria, my behavior was even worse. I felt uncomfortable. With this girl, I was annoyed that she tried to flirt with me. I was sure that she realized what was happening because I was behaving very differently. That at the beginning, that same day, at the end of class, she did not even say goodbye. I realized that she had stayed almost at the end, but I simply ignored her. I acted as if I was packing up my things. That week, the owl stopped visiting my house. However, my grandmother did not remove the crosses. The following days, I passed my hand over my bed to see if I could find any women's hairs, and they became fewer and fewer. The memory of Valeria did not come to my mind. In fact, it was so uncomfortable that one Wednesday morning I decided to talk to my boss. I told her that I was not interested in continuing to work on Saturdays for personal reasons. I would just continue teaching classes at the university, but not at the language center. A little discouraged, she told me that she understood perfectly, but that if I could please cover this last Saturday while she found a replacement. When I had the last class with the group, I did not tell them that I would not see them anymore. I was a little sad, because in general, I felt comfortable with them. But the rejection I began to feel towards Valeria was greater. That was the last time I saw her, and I am very grateful to have made that decision. I will be honest. It was as if a weight was lifted off my shoulders. It was as if not seeing her relieved me. All the rejection and negative feelings I had about her began to fade away as the days went by. My grandmother and my mother were calm because I looked much better at her. I spent a little more time working at that school because I liked it. On one occasion, I remember that it was a Friday afternoon. I met Valeria in one of the hallways of the university. When I saw her, I felt a slight discomfort. She saw me and tried to approach me, but I think she noticed my face and just continued on her way. I had never believed in witchcraft, but the way that man and my grandmother knew that what was happening to me was caused by that got me thinking. I still don't know if that woman on the bus was related to Valeria, but since I started to distance myself from her, I stopped seeing her. It may sound a little drastic, but I really stopped eating anything that someone gave me, even when my students did. I simply told them that I would save it to eat later. If you liked the video, please don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. This community is made by you. Don't forget that. Thank you very much, and good night.